Dyatlov Pass begins with a tent slashed open from the inside on the slopes of Holat Siakal, where 9 experienced hikers fled barefoot into a -30-degree blizzard. Some died of cold, but others suffered crushed ribs and fractured skulls without a single bruise, suggesting a violent force that left no external mark. Late-night mysteries like this are your kind of rabbit hole. Like the video and subscribe to Sleepwalk Files. We follow the trail of radioactive clothing and floating orange spheres to examine secret Soviet weapon tests, ending with the question of what specific frequency dismantled their bodies. Igor Dyatlov was a man of precision. As a student at the Ural Polytechnical Institute, he engineered his hiking trips. Every piece of gear was weighed, every route was mapped, and every member of his 9-person team was chosen for their endurance. By late January 1959, the group had pushed deep into the northern Urals, heading toward a peak the local Mansi people called Kholat Syakhl. In their own language, that name translates to the Dead Mountain. The last normal moment recorded in their journals was a quiet evening on February 1st. They had pitched their tent on a bleak, exposed slope, sheltered by nothing but the wind. They ate, they wrote in their diaries, and they fell asleep, believing they had found a secure spot for the night. But something happened in the darkness of those early February hours that bypassed every survival instinct they possessed. When search parties finally reached the slope weeks later, they found the tent still standing, but it looked like it had been attacked from within. A knife had been used to slash through the heavy canvas in a deliberate, urgent attempt to get out. The scene they discovered was a frozen snapshot of pure, unadulterated terror. The hikers hadn't used the door, they hadn't taken their boots, they had simply cut their way through the fabric and stepped out into a -30-degree blizzard, barefoot and half-dressed. The scene was a frozen snapshot of terror. Searchers found the hikers' belongings still inside the tent, neatly arranged. Their boots, heavy coats, and food supplies remained untouched. For experienced mountaineers, leaving boots behind in the Ural winter is a death sentence. It isn't a mistake, it's a flight. They weren't walking away from the tent, they were running from something that made the lethal cold feel like the lesser of two evils. As investigators followed the footprints in the snow, the mystery shifted from a strange disappearance to a forensic nightmare. The first few bodies were found scattered between the tent and a nearby cedar tree, some huddled together, others stripped of their clothes in the final stages of hypothermia. At first glance, it looked like a tragic accident, a sudden panic leading to exposure. But then the autopsies began, and the medical examiners found something that didn't fit the narrative of a storm. Several of the hikers had suffered catastrophic internal injuries. One man had a fractured skull, others had ribs that had been crushed inward with immense force. The examiners described the damage as being equivalent to the impact of a high-speed car crash. Yet, there was a detail that defied logic. There were no external bruises, no lacerations, and no skin abrasions. It was as if the force that shattered their bones passed right through their skin, leaving the surface untouched while liquefying organs and snapping the skeletal structure underneath. It's hard to wrap my head around. How do you crush a human ribcage without leaving a single mark on the chest? The official story of a compelling unknown force feels like a placeholder. If a predator had attacked them, there would be claw marks or bite wounds. If an avalanche had hit them, the tent wouldn't have been standing, and the bodies would have been buried in a single mass of snow and debris. Instead, the injuries were selective and internal. The patterns suggest a specific kind of violence. The crushed chests and fractured skulls weren't the result of a physical blow from a fist or a rock. They were the result of a massive, sudden increase in pressure. The evidence points toward a high-pressure wave, a concussive blast of energy that could compress a human body in a fraction of a second. When you look at the layout of the slope, the way the hikers fled in different directions, and the nature of those internal ruptures, the storm stops looking like the cause of death and starts looking like the cover. The wind and snow had hidden the tracks, but they couldn't hide the state of the bodies. The hikers were subjected to a physical phenomenon that the Soviet authorities of 1959 seemed desperate to categorize as an accident. If the force was a pressure wave, where did it come from? There were no craters in the snow, no shrapnel, and no signs of an explosion. The mountain remained silent, but the bodies of the 9 hikers showed a weaponized force had reached out from the dark and dismantled them from the inside out. As the investigation closed, the files were sealed and the area was restricted. The official verdict was vague, almost poetic, blaming a force that couldn't be named. But for those who looked at the forensic photos, the unknown force had a specific signature. It was the signature of a technology that killed by crushing, leaving the skin as a perfect, unbroken mask over a ruined interior. This left the investigators, and later the theorists, with a realization the hikers hadn't been running from the weather. They were running from something that could strike them without touching them. As we move away from the slope of Kholat Syakhl and look at the reports from other groups in the region that night, we find the hikers weren't the only ones who saw something impossible in the sky. You were a Soviet citizen in early 1959. You knew the Ural Mountains were a landscape of silence, dotted with closed cities and military installations that didn't appear on any civilian map. For most, the mountains were a place for hiking and sport, but for a few, they were a backdrop for something clinical and cold. When investigators interviewed other trekking groups and military personnel in the region shortly after the deaths of Igor Dyatlov and his team, they expected to hear about sudden storms or perhaps a rogue avalanche. Instead, they heard about lights. Specifically, they heard about spheres. These weren't the flickering lights of a distant village or the steady glow of a campfire. Witnesses described glowing orange orbs that floated with a deliberate hovering motion over the ridges of the Urals on the very night the hikers fled their tent. One account described these spheres as drifting through the sky, not following the laws of wind or aviation, but appearing to survey the terrain below. A single report of a light in the sky is easy to dismiss as a planet or a trick of the atmosphere. But when multiple unrelated groups in a restricted military zone report the same vivid orange glow on the same night, the story shifts. It suggests the panic on the slope of Kholat Syakhl was a reaction to a visual encounter. Inside that tent, in the middle of the night, the temperature had plummeted, and suddenly the darkness was replaced by a hovering, luminous presence. The hikers tore through the canvas of their own shelter in a desperate rush to get away. An experienced hiker knows that stepping into a blizzard without boots is a death sentence. You only do that if the thing inside the tent, or the thing hovering just outside it, is more terrifying than the freezing wind. It's hard to wrap my head around that level of terror. These people had survived the harshest conditions the Urals could throw at them, yet they chose the cold over whatever was watching them from the sky. As reports of these orange spheres piled up, the mystery shifted from a hiking accident toward a military event. The Soviet Union was in a feverish arms race with the United States, and the Urals were a prime location for testing new technologies. A theory began to circulate that these spheres were man-made. In the late 50s, the USSR was experimenting with rocket propulsion and atmospheric weaponry. A hovering orb could have been a failed missile test, a prototype drone, or a plasma discharge from a high-altitude weapon. A secret military project had gone wrong. It would explain why the Soviet authorities closed the case so quickly. The official verdict that the group died due to a compelling unknown force is one of the vaguest sentences in legal history. It's the kind of phrasing used when the truth is a state secret. If the hikers had witnessed a classified weapon test, they were witnesses to something the Kremlin couldn't allow the public to know. The orange spheres provide a potential source for the violence. If these objects were emitting high-energy radiation or a concentrated sonic frequency, it would explain the psychological break the group suffered. In other UFO encounters, witnesses describe a feeling of overwhelming dread or an irresistible urge to flee, often accompanied by a humming sound that vibrates in the chest. If the hikers were caught in the path of such a frequency, the compelling force might have been a physical wave of energy that triggered a primal, uncontrollable panic. This turns the slashed tent into a crime scene of a different sort. The hikers weren't fleeing a physical attacker they could see or fight. They were fleeing a sensation. The orange spheres would be the catalyst, the visible marker of a weapon or a phenomenon that dismantled their composure before it ever touched their skin. It changes the way we look at the footprints leading away from the camp. They were escaping a zone of influence. Of course, the presence of lights in the sky doesn't automatically explain the crushed ribs and fractured skulls found later. A floating orb doesn't usually leave a body looking like it was hit by a car while remaining externally unbruised. If the orange spheres caused the panic, they must have been capable of more than just glowing. They would have had to emit something, a pressure wave, a burst of energy, or a concentrated beam that could penetrate the human body and shatter bone without breaking the skin. The story now moves from a strange sighting to a forensic puzzle. If a hovering object caused the panic, and that object was a piece of military hardware, the hikers' bodies should hold the evidence. A weapon that can crush a chest from a distance leaves a signature. Whether it's a chemical residue, a thermal burn, or something invisible, the catalyst for the deaths should have left a physical trace on the victim's clothing or in their tissues. As investigators looked closer at the recovered items, they found something the orange spheres had hinted at. The hikers had encountered a source of hazardous energy. When forensic teams analyzed the garments recovered from the frozen slope, they discovered a detail that didn't fit the narrative of a natural disaster. On some of the clothing, they found high levels of beta radiation. This wasn't the kind of background radiation found in the soil of the Urals. It was concentrated, localized, and entirely out of place. The clothing recovered from the slopes of Kholat, Siakal carried the scent of smoke and frozen pine. When the garments were brought into a sterile Soviet lab, technicians noticed something that didn't belong on a hiking expedition. They weren't looking for radiation, but the Geiger counters began to click with a rhythmic, insistent urgency. This wasn't the low-level hum of the Earth's natural crust. It was a concentrated, artificial signature clinging specifically to the fabric of the hikers' clothes. The anomaly was most prominent on the clothing of Alexander Koligov and Semyon Zolotaryov. If the radiation had come from a general atmospheric event, like a distant nuclear test, the entire area would have been contaminated. But the soil around the tent was clean. The snow was clean. The radiation was an island, trapped in the fibers of the wool and cotton. It's as if the hikers had walked through a localized cloud of particles, or perhaps had come into direct contact with a physical object that was leaking energy. This discovery shifted the investigation from a tragedy of errors to a question of proximity. To get that kind of beta particle saturation on a piece of clothing, you have to be close to the source. You have to be within the immediate blast radius of a malfunction or standing right next to a leaking core. In the Soviet Union of 1959, only a few things produced that specific kind of signature. The most likely candidate was a rocket. During this era, the Soviet Union was frantically testing R-7 Semyorka missiles, the massive boosters that would eventually put Sputnik into orbit. These rockets used volatile fuels and nuclear-adjacent technologies. A failed launch or a missile that broke apart in the upper atmosphere would rain debris across the Urals. If a piece of a nuclear-powered guidance system or a contaminated fuel tank had plummeted toward the mountain, it would have appeared as a streak of fire in the sky, exactly like the orange spheres reported by other witnesses. The timeline fits a pattern. If a missile had suffered a catastrophic failure over the northern Urals, the resulting debris would have created a localized fallout zone. The hikers, pitched in their tent on the slope, would have been caught in a rain of invisible high-energy particles. But radiation of that level doesn't usually cause a panic. It doesn't make you slash your tent open and run barefoot into a blizzard. Beta radiation is a slow killer. It burns the skin and poisons the blood over days and weeks. It doesn't trigger an immediate blind flight for survival. The radiation proves that something man-made and hazardous was present, but it doesn't explain the terror. It suggests the radiation was a byproduct, a secondary effect of a more violent event. If a missile had crashed nearby, it wouldn't leave only radioactive dust. It would create a massive kinetic impact, a shockwave that could flatten trees and rupture eardrums. When the search parties reached the tent, they found the surrounding forest undisturbed. There was no crater, no jagged shards of titanium, and no scorched earth. The radioactive clothing was the only evidence a weapon had been there. It was a ghost trace. The energy source left a fingerprint on the hiker's clothes, but the object itself had vanished, or perhaps a military cleanup crew recovered it long before the civilian searchers arrived. Reports from the era mentioned special detachments operating in the Urals, units trained to recover fallen satellites and secret prototypes with absolute discretion. These teams moved in silence, scrubbing sites of any identifiable technology. If such a team had reached the slope first, they would have cleared the wreckage, but they couldn't clear the radiation already soaked into the wool of a hiker's jacket. They could remove the metal, but they couldn't remove the isotopes. This suggests the hikers were witnesses to a failure of the state. They had seen something falling from the sky that emitted a blinding light and lethal energy. Their flight from the tent wasn't a reaction to the radiation, which they couldn't feel, but to the atmospheric pressure and the sonic boom that accompanies a high-velocity impact. The radiation on the clothing acts as a forensic bridge, connecting the orange spheres in the sky to the physical trauma of the bodies. It shows that the force that drove them out of their shelter was a piece of hardware, something heavy, something fast, and something that was never meant to be found. As the investigators looked closer at the bodies, they realized a crashing missile, even a radioactive one, didn't account for the rest of the scene. A shockwave can break ribs, and a fall can fracture a skull, but it cannot explain why some of the victims were found with their internal organs crushed as if by a hydraulic press, while their skin remained perfectly intact. The radiation explained the presence of a weapon, but not the surgical nature of the destruction. The hikers had been touched by something that burned, blasted, and dismantled them from the inside out. To understand how a person can be crushed without a bruise, we have to leave the radioactive dust behind and follow the trail deeper into the ravine, where the most mutilated bodies were waiting under 4 meters of snow. By May 1959, the search for the missing hikers had shifted from a rescue mission to a recovery operation. The first 5 bodies had been found on the slope, but the remaining 4 had vanished into the mountain's geography. It took months for the snow to recede enough for a search party to venture into a deep, cedar-lined ravine nearly a mile from the tent. There, buried under 4 meters of packed snow and ice, the investigators found the rest of the group. They weren't huddled together for warmth. They were scattered, some facing the slope and others facing the stream, as if they'd been tossed there by a force that didn't care about the orientation of the bodies. Among them was Lyudmila Dubanina. When the forensic team cleared the ice from her face, they found a detail that changed the nature of the investigation. Lyudmila was missing her tongue, the entire organ sliced away cleanly from the root. Her eyes were gone as well. Early reports suggested scavengers, perhaps wild animals that had found the bodies before the snow covered them. But the investigators noted something strange. The soft tissue of the face was gone, yet the surrounding skin was remarkably intact. There were no jagged tear marks, no claw wounds, and no signs of the typical chewing patterns left by wolves or crows. The mystery deepened when the pathologists examined the interior of the chest cavity. They found the lungs filled with a strange, frothy fluid, and the internal organs showed signs of massive systemic failure. It didn't look like the result of a slow freeze or gradual suffocation. It looked like a sudden, violent displacement of matter. The medical examiners began to ask how a tongue and eyes could be removed without leaving a single scratch on the cheeks or forehead. This is where the theory of the pressure wave enters the record. Some researchers looked past the idea of a physical attacker and toward the physics of sound and air. They pointed to the possibility of a high-energy burst, something like a focused sonic weapon or a vacuum implosion. If a person is hit by a specific frequency of infrasound sound waves below the threshold of human hearing, the effect is physical. At high enough decibels, these waves can cause the internal organs to vibrate at their own resonant frequency. Think of a glass shattering when a singer hits the right note. The theory suggests that same principle applied to the human body. A concentrated burst of this energy could create a pressure differential so extreme that it pushes soft tissue out of the body. The tongue and eyes, being the most loosely anchored soft tissues in the head, would be the first to be displaced. It wouldn't be a surgical removal, but a physical ejection caused by a wave of pressure moving from the inside out. This would explain why the bodies in the ravine seemed so haphazardly placed. If the hikers had been caught in a localized atmospheric event or a weaponized pulse, they wouldn't have been walking. They would have been thrown. The force of a sonic bloom can knock a grown adult off their feet and propel them several meters, leaving them stunned and disoriented in a landscape where a single mistake means death. The investigators found another clue in the position of the bodies. Several of the hikers in the ravine were found with their hands clawing at the earth or clutching the roots of the cedar trees. It looked as though they had tried to anchor themselves to the mountain, fighting against an invisible wind or a vibration that was trying to shake them apart. They weren't fighting a predator they could see, they were fighting the air around them. This was a weapon. It wasn't a traditional bomb. A bomb leaves a crater, burns, and shrapnel, but the ravine was pristine. The cedar trees were still standing. The snow, once it melted, showed no signs of a blast radius. This suggested a technology designed to be silent and invisible, a weapon that targets the biology of the victim rather than the environment. The Soviet military was obsessed with non-lethal disorientation tools during this era, but the results in the ravine were anything but non-lethal. The state of Lyudmila's remains suggested a force that had vibrated the coherence of her body until it failed. The forensic files noted that the internal trauma was consistent with a high-pressure shock wave, the kind that occurs during a deep-sea implosion or a high-altitude vacuum collapse. But why would such a force be present on a remote slope in the Urals? The radiation on the clothing discovered earlier now took on a new meaning. Radiation is often a byproduct of high-energy physics. If the Soviet government was testing a device that could generate these pressure waves, perhaps a prototype for a vacuum bomb or a sonic disruptor, the radiation wouldn't be the primary weapon. It would be the exhaust. The hikers had walked into the focal point of a frequency. The timing of this is what stands out. The hikers fled their tent in a panic, suggesting the event started suddenly. If a sonic pulse had hit them, it would have first triggered an intense, primal feeling of dread, a known side effect of infrasound. It causes the chest to tighten, the vision to blur, and an overwhelming urge to flee. They didn't run because they saw something scary. They ran because their nervous systems were being hijacked by a frequency that told them they were about to die. It wasn't a visual threat that drove them, but a biological hijack. By the time they reached the ravine, the pulse may have intensified, turning a psychological trigger into a physical hammer. The hikers who died on the slope may have been on the periphery of the wave, suffering internal fractures and crushing pressure, but those in the ravine, buried deep in the snow, took the full force of the emission. This targeted destruction transforms the Dyatlov Pass incident from a tragic accident into a crime scene of scientific experimentation. The bodies in the ravine were victims of the cold and data points of a weapon designed to dismantle the human form from the inside. When the Soviet authorities closed the case with the vague phrase "compelling unknown force," they were hiding a failure and the fact that they had found a way to kill without leaving a fingerprint. The question then becomes, who authorized the test? And did they know the hikers were there to find that answer? We have to look beyond the bodies and into the maps of the region. Maps that show the Ural Mountains were more crowded with secrets than the public was ever told. The maps provided to the hikers were civilian-grade, simplified versions of a landscape that was actually a patchwork of forbidden zones. Military charts of the Sverdlovsk region from the late 50s show the area surrounding Kholat Syakhl as a perimeter. There are coordinates marked with red ink, designated as restricted polygons where any unauthorized presence was treated as an act of espionage. These were the boundaries of the Soviet Union's most guarded laboratories where the line between physics and warfare blurred. Deep in the archives of the Soviet Defense Ministry, there are references to research into vacuum weapons. Unlike a traditional bomb that pushes air outward in a fiery blast, a vacuum weapon is designed to suck the oxygen out of a space, creating a sudden, violent collapse of atmospheric pressure. The goal was a weapon that could clear a bunker or a trench without destroying the infrastructure around it. It was a silent killer. To a person caught in the center of such a collapse, The pressure differential creates a physical shock that targets the weakest points of the human anatomy. The hikers are standing on that slope, the wind howling around them when a test sequence is triggered from a hidden installation miles away. They wouldn't have heard a bang. They would have felt a sudden sickening shift in the air, a momentary void that makes the lungs struggle to expand and the inner ear scream in disorientation. This kind of pressure shift doesn't leave a burn mark or a shrapnel wound. It creates a vacuum effect that can pull soft tissue from its moorings and rupture internal membranes. This explains why the group reacted with a primal, blind panic, slashing their way out of the tent as if the very air inside had become poisonous. Former engineers who worked in the closed cities of the Urals spoke in whispers decades after the Cold War ended. They described experiments with sonic frequencies, specifically low-frequency waves that could induce feelings of dread, nausea, and acute psychosis in human subjects. These were documented attempts to create a non-lethal area denial system. If the hikers had wandered into the focal point of such a transmission, the result wouldn't be a conscious decision to flee. It would be a neurological hijack. The brain, overwhelmed by a frequency it cannot hear but the body can feel, triggers a fight-or-flight response so intense that the victims forget their boots, their coats, and their own survival instincts. One fragmented memo from a regional military commander mentions a scheduled test of a new atmospheric device on the night of February 1st. The memo doesn't mention hikers, but it notes a failure in the containment of the wave, suggesting the effect drifted far beyond the intended target zone. If the hikers were the unintended targets of this drift, they were essentially walking into a giant, invisible acoustic chamber. The geography of Kholat Syakhl, with its steep slopes and bowl-like depressions, could have acted as a natural amplifier, bouncing the frequency back and forth until it reached a lethal resonance. The hikers set up camp in a place they thought was desolate, but they were actually sitting in the middle of a firing range. When the device was activated, the initial wave hit them as a psychological blow, driving them out of the tent in a state of delirium. As they scattered, some stumbled into pockets of higher pressure or lower vacuum, where the physical trauma occurred. The force didn't hit them from the outside. It resonated within them, vibrating their organs at a frequency the human body cannot sustain. The precision of the trauma is what stands out in this theory. In sonic warfare, different frequencies target different tissues. A certain hertz level can liquefy soft organs while leaving the skin untouched. A different frequency can shatter bone by creating a standing wave inside the skeletal structure. This would explain why searchers found some victims with shattered ribs and others with massive cranial trauma. Yet all of them lacked the bruising you'd expect from a physical blow. They weren't hit by a rock or a fist. They were hit by a sound. The Soviet state's reaction to the bodies reveals the stakes of this experimentation. The investigators classified the files under a level of secrecy usually reserved for nuclear launch codes. They didn't want the world to know about a hiking accident. They wanted to ensure the existence of the vacuum weapon remained a ghost. By labeling the cause of death as a compelling unknown force, they used the truth to hide the truth. The force was unknown to the public, but it was well known to the men in the restricted zones. As the investigators packed up their gear and left the mountain, they took the bodies, the logs, the photographs, and the testimonies of the local Mansi people who had reported strange sounds echoing through the valleys that night. The Mansi knew the mountain had a voice, but they didn't realize that voice was being synthesized in a laboratory. The hikers had become the first unplanned test subjects for a weapon designed to dismantle the human will and the human body simultaneously. The hikers weren't unlucky. They were invisible to the people pulling the trigger. To the technicians in the bunker, the slope of Kholat Syakhl was an empty coordinate on a map. They didn't see the tent or the 9 students trying to keep warm in the snow. They only saw a successful reading on a dial, a wave that had traveled the expected distance and achieved the desired effect. The timing of the test, the specific nature of the internal injuries, and the immediate military lockdown of the area all point toward a state-sponsored event. But while the vacuum weapon explains the physical wreckage, it doesn't explain why the state continued to monitor the site for years afterward. It suggests the experiment didn't end when the hikers died. The mountain had become a laboratory, and the deaths of the 9 were the baseline data for something more ambitious. In the basement archives of the KGB, files aren't always destroyed. Sometimes they're simply misfiled, renamed, or buried under layers of bureaucracy so no one thinks to look for them. If you examined the original search logs from February 1959, you'd find a series of reports written by the rescue teams and local militia. These early documents describe a scene of chaotic urgency, noting the tense position and the exact trajectory of the hikers' flight. But as these reports moved up the chain of command toward the regional prosecutors in Sverdlovsk, the language shifted. The change is visible in the ink. The raw descriptive notes of the first responders, mentioning the oddness of the radiation and the specific angles of the internal fractures, were replaced by sterilized summaries. By the time the final verdict was signed, the detailed forensic observations had vanished. In their place was a single phrase, a compelling unknown force. This wasn't a conclusion based on evidence, it was a legal shield. By labeling the cause as unknown, the state closed the case without providing a biological or meteorological explanation. One specific document from the period stands out, a memo regarding the autopsy of Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov. The initial medical notes mentioned the precise nature of the soft tissue damage and the absence of external bruising on the chest. In the official public record, however, these details were smoothed over. The discrepancy suggests a deliberate scrubbing process. Someone was reading these reports in real time, crossing out mentions of specific trauma and replacing them with vague terms like acute hypothermia. The investigation was closed with surprising speed. Usually a tragedy involving 9 students, including several top-tier engineers, would trigger a prolonged inquiry. Instead, the files were sealed and the area around Kholat Syakhl was placed under heightened surveillance. For years afterward, hikers reported seeing military patrols in sectors that were supposed to be open. These were technicians returning to the site. Accounts describe men in heavy coats, carrying specialized equipment, visiting the ravine where the final 4 bodies were found. They weren't looking for remains. They were taking soil samples and atmospheric readings. This shows the site remained a point of interest for the Soviet military long after the funerals. If the hikers had simply been victims of an avalanche or a freak storm, there would be no reason for the Ministry of Defense to maintain a quiet presence on a frozen slope for a decade. The pattern of the cover-up points toward a successful deployment. In clandestine weapons testing, a failure is a disaster, but a success is a secret. If a new frequency-based weapon or a vacuum pressure device functioned exactly as intended, the architects of the program wouldn't see the deaths of the hikers as a tragedy. They'd see them as an unplanned but valuable set of data. The hikers provided a real-world test of how a human body reacts to a specific, invisible force in a high-altitude environment. Consider the fate of the hikers' personal belongings. When the clothing was returned to the families, some pieces were missing. Specific garments flagged for high beta radiation levels disappeared from the evidence lockers. This wasn't an administrative error, it was a targeted removal of physical evidence. The state wanted to control the narrative and remove the molecules of the weapon from the public record. Several officers involved in the initial cover-up received sudden promotions. Men with no prior record of brilliance in forensic science ascended the ranks of the internal security apparatus. Their reward wasn't for solving the mystery, but for ensuring the mystery remained unsolved. They had managed the optics of a catastrophe, turning a potential international scandal into a local legend. This leaves us with a chilling realization about the official verdict. The compelling unknown force wasn't a mystery to the people who wrote the report. It was a code. It was a way of acknowledging that something happened without admitting what it was. The phrase served as a marker for those within the system, a signal that this specific file was protected by the highest levels of the state. When you look at the redacted lines in the surviving memos, you can see where the truth was excised. The gaps in the text correspond exactly to the moments where the rescuers described the orange spheres and the strange vibrations in the ground. The government didn't just hide the weapon, they tried to erase the witnesses' perception of it. They wanted the world to believe the hikers had simply panicked and run into the snow rather than reacting to a man-made horror. The evidence of the cover-up transforms the story. It moves the event from the realm of a tragic accident into the realm of a calculated operation. The hikers weren't just unlucky, they were an interference in a scheduled event. Their presence on the mountain was a variable the military hadn't accounted for, and their deaths became the cost of maintaining a secret. Moving away from the paper trail and the sterile archives of the KGB, we have to ask why this specific location was chosen. Why Kholat Syakhl? The answer isn't in the files, but in the geography. To understand why the weapon worked so effectively there, we have to look at the way the wind moves across the peaks and how the shape of the mountain can turn a sound wave into a physical hammer. The cover-up hid the weapon, but it couldn't hide the environment that made the weapon possible. To understand why 9 people would abandon their only shelter in a killing frost, we have to look at the air. On the night of February 1st, the atmosphere over Kholat Syakhl was cold and physically distorted. Meteorological records from the Sverdlovsk region indicate a violent interaction between the wind and the geography of the slope. The wind collided with the ridge in a way that created a phenomenon known as the Kármán vortex street. This happens when a steady flow of air hits a blunt object like a mountain peak and swirls into a series of alternating rotating eddies. The hikers huddled inside their tent, the canvas snapping in the gale. Outside, the wind was carving the air into invisible spinning cylinders. When these vortices align with the natural curvature of a valley, they can generate infrasound sound waves that drop below 20 Hz, the threshold of human hearing. You can't hear infrasound, but your body registers it. It manifests as a sudden, crushing sense of dread. It triggers the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for the fight or flight response, creating a physiological panic that feels like an external threat is standing right behind you, even when you're alone in the dark. For the hikers, this wouldn't have felt like a sound. It would have felt like a sudden, inexplicable surge of terror. One moment they were resting. The next, their nervous systems were screaming that they were in immediate, mortal danger. This explains the frantic nature of the tent's exit. They sliced through the heavy fabric from the inside, as if the walls of the tent had become a cage they had to escape at any cost. The weather provided a psychological trigger. The specific temperature gradient that night created a temperature inversion layer, a meteorological ceiling where warm air traps colder air beneath it. In the Urals, this can act like a mirror for acoustic energy. If a secret military installation in the valley below had been pulsing a high-frequency signal or testing a vacuum burst device, that energy wouldn't have dissipated into space. Instead, it would have bounced off the inversion layer and reflected back down, concentrating the force directly onto the slope where the tent was pitched. This created a lethal feedback loop. The mountain's shape focused the energy, and the atmospheric ceiling kept it trapped. The hikers were standing inside a natural parabolic reflector. The air around them became a medium for a force they couldn't see or hear, but which was vibrating the fluid in their inner ears and the air in their lungs. Reports from the Mansi indigenous people who lived in the foothills spoke of dead zones in the mountains, places where animals refused to go and where the silence felt heavy, almost liquid. These zones often correlate with the geological formations that produce infrasound. The hikers had pitched their tent in one of these focal points, unknowingly placing themselves at the center of a biological amplifier. When the energy hit, it caused panic and disrupted the vestibular system, the mechanism in the ear that controls balance. This explains why the searchers found the hikers wandering in erratic, zigzagging patterns away from the tent. They were dizzy, nauseated, and unable to tell up from down. In a whiteout blizzard, with their balance destroyed, the descent became a nightmare of disorientation. A specific detail in the autopsy of Semyon Zolotaryov points to this atmospheric interaction. Zolotaryov was the oldest member of the group, a veteran with a history of health issues. His lungs showed signs of extreme edema, a filling of the lungs with fluid that usually happens during high-altitude sickness or severe pressure changes. But the hikers weren't at an altitude that should have caused this. The edema suggests a sudden, violent change in the surrounding air pressure, the kind of pressure spike that occurs when a shock wave is amplified by a valley's walls. This suggests a conclusion about the compelling unknown force mentioned in the official Soviet verdict. The force wasn't necessarily a single weapon or a single event, it was a synergy. The Soviet military may have been testing a device that emitted a specific frequency, but that device might have been relatively harmless in an open field. It became a killer because it was deployed in a landscape that weaponized it. The mountain acted as the lens, and the atmosphere acted as the chamber. The hikers were the accidental subjects of a perfect storm where geography and technology merged. They were trapped in a sonic pocket where the air became toxic to the human mind and body. This explains why the search parties didn't experience the same panic. By the time the rescuers arrived, the wind patterns had shifted and the inversion layer had broken. The silent zone had vanished, leaving behind frozen corpses and a slashed piece of canvas. The weapon was hidden by the KGB and dismantled by the weather. Looking back at the final positions of the bodies, we see a trail of people trying to outrun a feeling. They weren't running from a man or a beast, but from a vibration that had rewritten their instinct for survival. They fled into the cold to escape a sound they couldn't even hear, moving further into the wilderness until the mountain stopped screaming and the cold took over. But the question remains, if the mountain was the amplifier, who provided the signal? The radiation on the clothes and the orange spheres in the sky suggest the trigger wasn't natural. The hikers had wandered into a live fire exercise where the environment was the most dangerous component of the weapon. They died in a storm, erased by a frequency that turned their own biology against them. The snow on Kholat Syakhl preserves things that were meant to be forgotten. If you look at the original photographs of the campsite, there's one detail that often gets overlooked. Beside the slashed tent, there are footprints. Along with the frantic tracks of people fleeing, there are deep, heavy impressions of boots that didn't belong to any of the 9 hikers. These prints don't lead toward the forest or the ravine, they lead directly to the tent, stop, and then vanish into the white. For decades, the official narrative focused on a compelling unknown force, a phrase that served as a convenient curtain for the Soviet state. But the answer isn't in a vague adjective, it's in the journals. In the final entries of the group's diary, the handwriting changes, the neat, disciplined script of Igor Dyatlov begins to fray. The last few lines aren't about the weather or the route. They describe a feeling of oppressive weight, a sensation that the air had become thick, almost liquid, pressing against their chests. This was the physical manifestation of a targeted frequency. In the timeline of the Soviet Union's Project 7 research, there is a series of tests conducted in the late 50s involving high-energy plasma bursts. These weren't bombs, they were pulses designed to disrupt the nervous system of an enemy, creating a state of total, irrational terror. The goal was to clear a battlefield without firing a single bullet. The hikers stumbled into a test range and became unintended calibration targets for a weapon that used the mountain's own geometry. The slope of Kholat Syakhl acted as a parabolic reflector, focusing a beam of energy directly onto that specific patch of snow. When the pulse hit, it triggered a biological override. The brain's amygdala, the center for fear, was slammed into overdrive. The sensation was so violent and visceral that the only instinct left was to escape the shelter at any cost. They slashed the tent from the inside because the fabric felt like it was suffocating them. They ran into the -30-degree night because their nervous systems were screaming that the tent had become a death trap. The lack of 1 or 2 pairs of boots wasn't an oversight. It was a symptom of a mind that no longer recognized the concept of cold, only the need to move away from the source of the signal. A decrypted memo dated 3 weeks after the recovery of the bodies mentions a recovery of technical debris from the area of the campsite. The memo doesn't describe a crashed missile or a fallen satellite. It describes a series of metallic pylons, small and unassuming, that had been planted in the permafrost to guide the beam. These pylons were removed by a specialized unit before the civilian investigators were allowed back onto the slope. This explains the radioactive dust on the clothes. It wasn't fallout from a distant explosion, but residue from the plasma generators used to power the pylons. The radiation was localized because the source was right there beneath their feet, humming at a frequency that turned their blood into a conductor. As the hikers wandered toward the cedar tree and the ravine, the effect of the weapon shifted. The initial pulse of terror gave way to a secondary effect: internal resonance. Every human organ has a natural frequency. If you hit that frequency with enough power, the organ vibrates violently against its own housing. This is how a chest can be crushed without a single bruise on the skin. The ribs didn't break because something hit them from the outside. They snapped because the lungs and heart were vibrating with such intensity that they shattered the bone from within. By the time Ludmila Dubinina and her companions reached the ravine, they were experiencing a total systemic collapse along with the freezing cold. The missing tongue and eyes weren't the result of scavengers as the official report claimed. In high-energy acoustic events, soft tissues with high water content are the first to liquefy and be expelled by the pressure. They were dismantled by a sound they couldn't even hear. The Soviet government covered up a tragedy and archived a success. The Dyatlov group provided the state with a dataset showing the exact threshold at which a human being will abandon everything: their gear, their friends, and their own survival instincts to escape an invisible force. The compelling unknown force was the name given to a weapon that worked perfectly. You visit the mountain today, the wind still howls across the slope of the dead mountain. Most tourists see a beautiful, desolate landscape, but the topography still shows the curve of the land that creates that lethal focus. The pylons are gone and the files are buried in vaults in Moscow, but the geography remains. The hikers left behind a tent, some boots, and a series of unanswered questions. For a few hours on a February night, 9 people felt the air turn into a hammer, and they spent their final moments running away from a sound that only they could feel. As the snow settles back over the ravine, one image remains: a single barefoot print in the frost, leading away from a slashed tent, pointing toward a horizon that offered no warmth, only the silence of a successful experiment. You enjoyed this episode? Subscribe to Sleepwalk Files to stay up to date with new mysteries and long videos to fall asleep to every night.